Hi again, everyone. It's 5 o'clock here in New York. I'm Alicia Menendez in for Nicole Wallace. You know, we are 25 days away from the start of Donald Trump's second administration, a day on which he is promising to unleash a litany of executive orders. Throughout the campaign, he made a number of promises that Axios has tabulated. Here are some of the things he has promised to do on day one. End the war of Russian aggression against Ukraine, even though the Russians unleashed bombs on the Ukrainian people on Christmas Day. Close the U.S.-Mexico border and unleash the largest deportation plan since President Eisenhower. He promised to cut funding to public schools that teach, quote, critical race theory, even though that is, not an actual thing. He also promised to cut funding to schools that have vaccine mandates, which affects all 50 states because they require certain vaccinations for children to enter public schools, with some exceptions. He promised to increase drilling and fracking, even though U.S. oil production has neared a record high under President Biden. And one expert told Politico that a president's ability to affect oil and gas production in the near term is not zero, but it's pretty close. He promised to end inflation in its tracks and make life affordable again, a promise that, as you know well, he is already walking back. He told Time magazine that, quote, it's hard to bring prices down once they're up. It's very hard. He also promised to circumvent the Constitution and end birthright citizenship.
You've promised to end birthright citizenship on day one. Is that still your plan?
Yeah, absolutely.
The 14th Amendment, though, says that, quote, all persons born in the United States are citizens. Can you get around the 14th Amendment with an executive action?
We're going to have to get a change. We'll maybe have to go back to the people, but we have to end it.
And that, friends, that litany, it is just a small sample of the promises he made. And I'm setting aside the pardons for the people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th, the Trump tariff taxes, his deregulatory boom. Let's be realistic. Trump, not a man who's about the details. But the folks over at the Heritage Foundation, the ones who penned Project 2025, well, they are. And lucky for President-elect, a bunch of those folks, they are coming with him to the White House, including Russell Vought, his former and future White House budget chief. And he has been busy the past few years. According to two undercover journalists at the Center for Climate Reporting, Russell Vought has overseen the production of policy packets, executive orders, and agenda items that would be handed to the Trump administration on day one, which works out well for Trump because he can focus on his expanding wish list of things he'd like to do during his second term, which includes taking the Panama Canal, Greenland, turning Canada and its 41 million citizens into America's 51st state. Denmark, a NATO ally of the United States, just announced a major new military ramp-up for Greenland, and you got to wonder why. And that is where we start today with some of our favorite friends. Jelani Cobb, Dean of the Columbia University School of Journalism, Republican strategist Susan Del Percio, and Julian Castro, who served as the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in the Obama administration. It is good to see you all, especially you two. I mean, what a Christmas miracle to have the two of you with me anywhere near Rockefeller Center. So thank you for being with us. Those are a lot of promises. I feel like the first thing I learned in parenthood was never to promise because everyone remembers the promises.
Exactly. Unfortunately, parenthood and presidencies, especially with this president, may not be the same. Because there are lots of things that he promised in his first term, and people didn't really hold him accountable for that, and at least not among his core constituencies. And then there's the other version of it: when people plan, God laughs. That applies to presidencies too. There's a whole list of things that you may plan to do, but it generally is the case that you are doing those things in concert with world events, the wildly unpredictable sprawl of world affairs, and that you spend at least as much time reacting as you do being proactive. And so this may be a wish list, but it can't actually be taken as a one-to-one correlation between what will happen in this administration.
Right, that's a good point, because Susan Del Percio, some of those things can be done through executive action. You can come in on day one, you can issue a bunch of executive orders, but even some of those things require funding, which then requires Congress. So when you talk about mass deportations, he can't really do that on his own. He needs a funding mechanism that goes through Congress, which means he's going to need Republican senators who may be up for re-election to decide that they want to spend billions, maybe trillions of American tax dollars on a mass deportation that I would wager is not actually that popular once it's in effect.
I don't think it'll get in effect. To carry on that point, of the wish list and how, politicians, whether you're running for governor or president or anything in between, they always say on day one, and I always chuckle to myself because day
you're going to figure out where the bathroom is on day
that's
one.
a nice day one.
Right.
But the thing with Trump is he doesn't have to get the job done. He just needs enough. So, for example, if he starts deporting 1,000 criminals, for example, that's enough of a fig leaf for Trump to say, I've started my mass deportation. Now, it may be 1,000 people in the next 6 months, but he will use that as job done. He only needs a little bit of the job to be done, so he can get something in motion. Now, on prices, it's really interesting because I think someone finally told Donald Trump that inflation and prices have nothing to do with one another. When one goes down, the inflation comes down, the prices that raise stay there. It's just the buying power that changes. So someone's been whispering in his ear about that, saying you probably should walk that back. And as far as the other things, the Panama Canal, who did he have dinner with the night before he said that? That's what I want to know. Like, he really just kind of goes on those tangents.
Right.
Can I add one thing on the 14th Amendment? So the 14th Amendment provided birthright citizenship after the Civil War because there was this question of whether or not the 4 million people who were emancipated by the end of the Civil War were actually citizens. That's why we have that in the Constitution. If you can just sidestep that, something that was consecrated by the blood of 700,000 people who died in the course of that war, there's nothing to stop you from getting around parts of the Constitution that you do like. For instance, the Second Amendment. You can't just pick and choose what parts of the Constitution are valid to you. And so if you're saying that you're going to get around the 14th Amendment, I'm going to go on a limb and say that's not going to happen and is nowhere near as easy as he seems to have presented it in his rhetoric.
But if he says it and he puts a bill in, for example, doesn't that get him for what he needs? I mean, for Donald Trump, for any other
political purposes, yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
If it actually is about messaging. And Julian Castro, to the point that Susan Del Percio made about the fact that a lot of these proclamations come from, whoever was in his ear last, it puts Democrats, we've watched it, put Democrats in a tricky spot where they have to decide what they respond to. They have to decide what bait it is that they take. And they have to be really clear about who it is that they are advocating for, right? So, I think about all of these efforts around DOJ. You don't want to be the ones defending bureaucracy. That isn't the winning message. You want to be the ones defending, the services that government provides, the way in which American lives benefit from the U.S. government. But you see, once again, the tricky dance that Democrats find themselves in.
Well, it really is, Alicia. And look, I mean, one thing is clear, or two things are clear in my mind. First of all, that Trump knows what he's doing more now as he enters his second term than he did 8 years ago when he was preparing to enter his first term. And secondly, he is going to do everything that he can to repeal the administrative progress that the Biden administration has made on a whole range of issues, whether it's pro-environment, improving our immigration system, making it more fair, humane, protecting people with disabilities, you name it, along a series of different issues. On day one, they are going to immediately, I think, try and roll back what the Biden administration has done where they can. How far they'll get with that, whether they'll trip up over some, policies or laws that they have to follow that they don't end up following that'll bite them back in court, we'll see. But they will try it. It is going to be important for Democrats, though, to have a strategy on messaging and on which pitches they're going to swing at. And I think you see really the Trump crowd giving Democrats a gift because Elon Musk and these other billionaires are so at the forefront of shaping what looks like is going to be their policy approach and the politics of it. This is going to be a pro-billionaire, billionaires first agenda. And Democrats have an opportunity when the ACA subsidies come up, when the Trump tax scheme renewal comes up, to push that. I think that's going to resonate with the American people. And if they stick with that messaging, I think that's going to be good for Democrats.
It's funny. I noticed that the messaging that Julian just referenced during this last fight over funding the government, where you had Minority Leader Jeffries saying that Democrats stood up to the, quote, billionaire boys club. So that has certainly been a part of it. There's that piece of it. There's also the piece of it that's the Russell votes of the world, right? That are the people who the first time around perhaps did not understand how they could fully leverage government resources in service of the policies they wanted. But one, they had time in government. Then they had time in between the Trump administration 1.0 and the Biden administration, now the Trump 2.0, in which to prepare and learn. And so they are coming in armed and ready in a way that they were not the first time around. And that makes it fundamentally different.
That's absolutely true. And, you know, that was one of the lines that you heard during the campaign, first in the Biden campaign, then in the Harris campaign, where they were saying that these are people who have adapted and learned new skills over the course. Even when you look at, you know, the fact that Trump won in 2016, he looked intimidated by that. You know, he looked frightened out of his mind, you know, on the verge of the presidency. Now, not so much. And so, contrary to the risk of contradicting myself, the other side of this is that they are likely to be more efficient, likely to be more effective. It also means that there's a higher possibility of overreach. If you can actually attain the things that you say that you're going to do, well, those margins in an election weren't all that big. Yeah. And at some point, you throw people off, you know, from the wagon.